to fat mass, female sex was the main driver, along with, and similarly for android fat mass, female sex was the main driver. In terms of our results, further results, when we did our correlation, so we saw that minimum weight for age Z-score had a direct and positive association with waist circumference as adults, fat mass, and android fat mass. When we examined our other variables of interest, looking at edema, sex, and rehabilitation weight gain, we saw that rehabilitation weight gain mediated the relationship between minimum WAS and adult adiposity, whereas female sex confounded the relationship. Edema played no role. In this very complex-looking plot, what we did was a sex disaggregated analysis, and we looked to see how quintiles of weight gain stacked up against measures of adult adiposity. And what this is basically showing us is that, again, was there a relationship between the highest rates of weight gain and adult adiposity. So this relationship did not hold true in women. And this was a threshold effect. It was weight gain exceeding 13 grams per kilogram per day. It was in those instances where we found the association with adult adiposity, but only in men. So I know I'm out of time. My key message is children who were least underweight at the time of admission for severe malnutrition, they experience faster greater adiposity as adults. Now, our results add to the growing evidence of sex differences in severe malnutrition, as boys were not only more prone to becoming more severely malnourished in the beginning, but they were also more susceptible to the long-term effects of faster rehabilitation weight gain. We submit that these findings should be explored in future interventional trials using different feeding regimes. I acknowledge the funding partner and my collaborators, and thank you for your attention and patience.
Thank you. The floor is now open for comments and questions.
Okay. All right. The question asks, this is for Dr. Cunningham. You mentioned the limitations to the tools used. Why did you not use 2 measuring tools to minimize the fallout in your study?
Hello? Okay, good. So, as I said, we were a bit confined by the time restrictions. I could have actually went very much deeper into the tools that we utilize. The gold standard tool, which is the free tool, is actually very time consuming. So it would have been an ideal tool to be utilized if in the research setting, but trying to find a tool in the clinical setting, it's not very feasible to use those other tools. In our study, the Edmonton Frail Scale it's been validated, and they've actually done other studies that have shown great correlation between the findings from that and the findings from the more exhaustive, primarily research tools. The drawback to using the gold standard tool is it requires specialized equipment, and even though I do have some of that equipment available to me, we wanted to do something that was reproducible. So not just at the UA, but also we wanted to include other centers, because anesthesia surgery is done at so many hospitals. So I wanted to be able to do something at UA, something at KPH, and also I wanted to do something at Noel Holmes all the way down in the west, Savannah Lamar Hospital, for example. So that's the reason why we had no problems using just the Edmonton Frail Scale, considering the correlation and the validity of its use.
go ahead.
Thompson. Dr. Thompson. Second. Prematurity.
No. No, it was not. Because in any instance, we did not have had children coming in for admission, they married. They or may not have had reliable data. 1960. Bear in mind the time frame and what was collected.
Dr. Thompson, what specific lifestyle changes or interventions can women implement to mitigate the effects of hormonal or metabolic changes on weight gain as they age, especially in comparison to men?
Well, I think the message is the same for both men and women. And it's typically what the ministry, various ministries, recommend. So based on the findings of this study, we see that women have greater adiposity. And of course, diet is going to determine it, but physical activity is also. I don't think this study suggests that there is anything, the results of this study, I should suggest that there is anything that women should different from men say. I think the message is the same. I think from the perspective of this study, we are more conscious. What is happening with boys, they're more susceptible to malnutrition, and they're more susceptible to our efforts. They're normalized. So that is the rising part. And whether or not we need to think about the rates of weight gain to engender. Bear in mind that recommendation from former WHO recommendation that weight gain of 10 grams per kilogram per day is considered good weight gain. And we are finding in our population, men who gain, boys, gained weight of 12.9, call it 30 grams per kilogram, have greater adiposity as adults. So it seems to me that what we need to think about is somehow capping and considering what is an upper acceptable during nutritional and balancing that need to, prevent death. Because a lot of times that's the goal. We don't want these children to die. We want them. Then we have to balance that. If we make them weight too, this can have long-term effects. So it's balancing the short-term and the long-term.
You can go ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Cunningham, or afternoon. One of your findings related to the sample size at the lower level education, but I'm wondering if that could just be related to the population that access care at the institution.
So that is a fair question that can really only be answered with assumptions. Because I would make the assumption that because the universities are, a lot of these patients have to actually pay before they get service versus the fully public hospital where service is rendered for free. So I'd make the assumption that if you're able to foot this sometimes relatively high bill, then looking at socioeconomic status, which is a marker that is income, then I would make the assumption that we would see a little bit of a higher status quo of patients. So we'd have to do like separate analysis of that on its own, but it is a fair question to ask. What we did notice though was that irrespective of what population seeks care at UWI, the findings were in keeping with, in terms of frailty being associated with socioeconomic status as the international studies that were done. So, fair question. I wish I had a longer study period with a greater patient population to fully answer. Thank you.
You can go ahead, Dr. Dawkins, right?
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone, and great presentations again. I must commend the team as well. I wanted to ask Dr. Cunningham, it's really just for clarification in terms of the study procedures. I may have missed it, but whilst you were presenting the information on the slide, in terms of whether the index of frailty was associated with less favorable outcomes, and I think you mentioned it in the comment you were making at the end, that it did appear to be an association with longer stay in hospital post-op. So just to confirm that that was a finding within the study. And the second part, in clarification, was it that these persons were identified as being more frail and so they were kept longer, or was it that it was observed as part of the study?
So for the second part of the question first, no. So when we actually did these studies, a lot of times it's when we go back and now we're accumulating our data and then we're looking back at the patient files to see how long they would have been in hospital. That is when we would realize, oh wow, those who we actually calculated greater frailty are the ones who stayed in hospital longer. There was an observation. In terms of who was frail versus not, the clinicians, both anesthesia, both surgery, no one was privy to that information. So it was an actual observation. In terms of the outcome, so the primary objective of the study was to look at prevalence. Initially, we did want to look at other perioperative outcomes, but I guess the medicine that we practice is just so good that there was just so little in terms of poor outcomes that there was nothing to analyze. I think we had maybe, of the 206, there were like 3 deaths. So the only thing that was worth analyzing and actually was of any significance was the length of stay in hospital. And then it was actually good that we found that because that can also help in terms of guiding public policy because of how expensive healthcare is. So the hope is that once we actually publish this, we can present it to the ministry so that we can put more, prevention is better than cure. So we can put more attention into doing rehabilitation instead of trying to focus on rehab, because there's a lot of benefit in doing rehabilitation for these patients, which in Dr. Toppin and some of the other guys at the university, they're actually doing other studies looking at this. So if anything, this is like a gateway study to really fully understand what goes into the care of the elderly population in our setting. So thank you for that question, so that I got the opportunity to clear that up.
Thank you.
And we have 2 more questions. You
Yes,
can
we
go
have
ahead.
2 questions online, one for Dr. Thompson and another for Ms. Campbell. Looking at your statistics over of undernutrition in the population or seen at your facility?
Indeed, we are. So, in fact, the TMRU board, which is from the 1950s, excited as the administration sustainable. I think what that means is that a job was well done in the sense that the outlying clinics were better equipped than any malnutrition early before it became severe. And so children could be then referred without the need. Yes, but even that admission rate really going down. Oh, that speaks to what is exactly going on and in the community. I would have to guess, but I suspect.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Campbell, great presentation. Do you think that the marginalization of males are why they are dying so, or is it because of crime and violence?
So I think as a preface to this question, I think I need to do a little bit more work to dig into causes of death as part of this research. But I would say what I noticed for males is that there's a high role for cardiovascular diseases as well as external causes. So from my look at the data so far, that's what we see are the major drivers for mortality rates higher than. Being said, we also see factors for women being neoplasm. So I think we need to look at both sexes as well and really identify the causes as well as the factors that are driving deaths across sexes or both within both sexes and really address those factors in policy.
Okay, thanks. That is all.
Okay. So thank you for joining us. We will now break for commercials.
What you got? I feel stressed out. 2 months from my baby and a peer problem with breastfeeding. The baby not get enough milk like when I'm in at the hospital.
So why you never tell me?
I didn't even know. I not rest. A peer problem with breastfeeding. People I was first diagnosed with cervical cancer at age 33. The treatment was not pretty. It was terrible. I couldn't go to work, and I spent the whole 5 years out of work. The pain, the struggle, I removed my womb. I thought, I'm finished with cancer. 2016, cancer come back. There's hope for your daughter. My experience don't have to be her experience. So mothers, give your children the vaccine. It will be good for your sake and for the children's sake.
Don't wait. Vaccinate against cervical cancer. A message from the Ministry of Health.
I want to see a Jamaica that is cervical cancer free. Cervical cancer is one of the leading in women in our nation, and I want this to stop. The HPV vaccine has been proven to be the most effective method to prevent cervical cancer. It is a safe vaccine, and it is best to give the vaccine to young girls before they've even been exposed to the HPV virus. So parents, I want to encourage you to let your daughters get the HPV vaccine. Let us protect our next generation against cervical cancer.
Don't wait. Vaccinate against cervical cancer. A message from the Ministry of Health.
I think they're ready for us now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the scientific session 2, where we'll focus on the SALT study. I'm your chair for this session, Dr. Tamu Davidson. We will have our, scientific session
one and our feature presentation for this afternoon will be focused on the Jamaican salt consumption study. And our guest is no stranger to us. Our guest today is Professor Trevor Ferguson. Now, Trevor Ferguson is the Professor of Epidemiology and Internal Medicine and Director of the Epidemiology Research Unit at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research at the University of the West Indies. He is also the Honorary Consultant in General Internal Medicine at the University Hospital of the West Indies. He is also a Fellow of the American College of Physicians and the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and a Bernard own scholar in cardiovascular health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He currently serves as the chair of the Jamaica's National Committee on NCDs. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Trevor Ferguson up to give this featured lecture presentation. Please give him a round welcome, and we like to say Louis Bennett applause. So if you're online, please make sure we can hear you loud and clear.
All right, so thank you very much, Dr. Davidson. Let me thank the Ministry of Health and Wellness for providing this opportunity for us to share some of our research findings and to share with the wider audience what's been happening with salt consumption in Jamaica. So the title of this presentation, the Jamaica Salt Consumption Study, we're looking at sodium intake, sodium content in restaurant foods, knowledge, attitudes, and practices, as well as spot urine sodium validation. So this study is a collaborative research project between the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the Caribbean Institute for Health Research, and is funded by the National Health Fund. The overall aim is to obtain baseline data on salt consumption in Jamaica, salt content in restaurant foods, and to evaluate knowledge, attitudes, and practices of Jamaicans regarding salt consumption. So why is this important? Why are we taking all the time and effort to learn about salt? So I'm sure some of us have had some salt for the day because it's fairly a ubiquitous product. So salt, or sodium chloride, is a major component of the food supply in most countries. It is commonly used to flavor food as a, okay, that moved too fast, as a binder and stabilizer, and also as a food preservative. Now my slides are doing their own thing. Is somebody else moving my slides? All right, let's see, are we at the right place now? All right, so slides behave. Okay, let's get right back to it. So in terms of what is the physiological role of sodium in the body, now humans require a small amount of sodium for daily body functions, and this includes important functions such as nerve conduction, the skeletal muscle contraction, also in the regulation of blood pressure and in the regulation of fluid balance. The main source of sodium in the diet is from table salt or sodium chloride, but other sources include monosodium glutamate, sodium bicarbonate, commonly known, of course, as baking soda. Now, most persons consume between 9 to 12 grams of salt per day, and this translates to about 3,500 to 4,700 milligrams of sodium, and is 1.5 times to 2 times the recommended maximum level of sodium intake. Where do we get salt from? So most of our sodium comes actually from processed foods and foods prepared outside the home. However, in developing countries in particular, salt is often added during cooking, and some persons also add salt at the table while eating. So it's important to recognize these potential sources of salt and to take the necessary corrective measures. Now, with regards to global sodium consumption, this is estimated to be high worldwide. In 2010, mean sodium consumption was estimated at 3.95 grams per day. Intake was higher in men and was highest in the East Asia and lowest in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin American countries. Updated estimates from the World Health Organization in 2023 suggested that sodium consumption may be increasing with an estimated sodium consumption of 4.3 milligrams per day. Now, high sodium consumption is associated with multiple adverse health outcomes. And this slide illustrates the various organ systems as well as the clinical manifestations of high salt consumption. So we see that high salt consumption is associated with high blood pressure, with ischemic heart disease, hypertensive diseases, heart failure, also associated with stroke and dementia, with chronic kidney disease and kidney stones, with stomach cancer, osteoporosis, and obesity. And it is estimated that these together are responsible for approximately 3 million deaths globally. Now, the WHO, in their response to the challenge or the problem related to excessive salt consumption, have published guidelines or recommendations in the Shake Technical Package. And the main pointers, of course, is that they recommend that sodium consumption should be less than 200 milligrams per day. Countries should target a 30% relative reduction in mean population sodium intake by 2025, and the Shake Package should be used as a guideline for member states to assist in the implementation of sodium reduction strategies. Now, in addition to sodium, potassium is also important, and studies have established that low potassium intake is associated with several non-communicable diseases, including hypertension, cardiovascular disease, kidney stones, and as well as low bone mineral density. Now, an increase in potassium intake can reduce blood pressure, can also reduce cardiovascular disease, and mitigate the negative consequences of a high sodium diet. The WHO therefore recommends that persons should increase potassium intake from food in an effort to reduce some of these adverse outcomes. And the recommended intake for potassium should be greater than 3,500 milligrams per day for adults. So on this background, the Jamaica Salt Consumption Study had 4 main objectives. These were to estimate dietary sodium consumption among Jamaicans using spot urine sodium analyses, to evaluate sodium content in commonly consumed foods sold in restaurants, to conduct a baseline survey on correct knowledge, attitudes, and practices regarding salt consumption in Jamaica, and to evaluate the accuracy of spot urine sodium as a measure of dietary sodium intake in the Jamaican setting by comparing this with estimates from 24-hour urine collection. So what have we done so far? We have published the study protocol that's available online, and so persons can check with this link. So it's published in F1000 Research, and you can learn all about the things that we're doing and the methods we're using and have access to our questionnaires, etc. So these tools are available for persons who are interested in this area of research. Now, the study was divided into 4 components based on each of the 4 objectives that we had mentioned. So the first component focused on spot urine sodium analyses, and this was done urine samples that were collected as part of the Jamaica Health and Lifestyle Survey in 2016 to 2017. From this study, we estimated mean 24-hour dietary sodium consumption, mean 24-hour dietary potassium consumption, and the proportion of participants who had high dietary sodium or low potassium consumption. And we also evaluate associations with factors such as sex, sociodemographic factors, and other participant characteristics. Our first output from this study, we presented our findings at the 2022 CARFA conference, and also presented at the 2022 Ministry of Health National Health Research Conference, and finally published the findings in the journal Medicine. So what we found here was that mean population sodium consumption was 3.6 grams per day, and this was significantly higher than the recommended 2 grams per day from the World Health Organization. Mean potassium consumption was 2.1 grams per day, again, significantly lower than that recommended by the World Health Organization. When we looked at the proportion of persons with high sodium consumption, this was found to be 67%, and 89% of Jamaicans had low potassium consumption. So from this, clearly there is quite a bit of work to do as we seek to correct these anomalies. Now, for the second component, we focused on salt content in foods sold in restaurants. And for this, we created a database of restaurants in Jamaica. We obtained data from the Companies Office of Jamaica, as well as searched through the Yellow Media pages for listed restaurants. So we were able to compile this database, and we focused for these analyses on chain restaurants, which were defined as having greater than or equal to 3 branches locally. For the chain restaurants, we contacted restaurant owners and managers to obtain information on meal items sold in each establishment, as well as available nutrient profiles, recipes, and ingredient listings. We were able to administer questionnaires to 7 of 29 chain restaurants, so the restaurant owners and managers weren't too keen on answering our questions, but we got some data. And we also compiled the data on menu items from these restaurants, and we will use the menu items to assess nutrient content using data from the USDA Food Central database. And from this, we expect to estimate mean sodium content per menu item sold, as well as the proportion of foods with high salt content. And for this USDA analyses, we have one of our MSc nutrition students working on these analyses, so we should be able to have something to share shortly. With regards to the interviews done with restaurant owners, we have prepared a poster which is part of this conference. So we're not going to go through this poster now, but I invite you all to go to the poster site and take a look at the findings that we had from the interview with our restaurant owners and managers. All right. So Google is listening. Okay, so in terms of the third component, here we aim to recruit a nationally representative sample of 1,200 participants, and we administered questionnaires to evaluate knowledge, attitudes, and practices regarding to salt consumption. We also measured weight, height, blood pressure, and collected spot urine samples for estimating sodium excretion. We were able to enroll 1,002 participants, of which approximately 490 provided spot urine samples. So with regards to the data on the sodium consumption, we will have an update in this afternoon's session. So again, I invite you to be here at 2 p.m. when we share the findings from the analysis of our spot urine samples. And I'll give a little sneak preview that we may have a little bit of goodish news. All right. With regards to the validation study, here we targeted a sample of 1,120 persons from whom we would collect 24-hour urine samples. And what we would do is also collect spot urine samples from the same participants and then compare the estimated 24-hour urine from the spot urine to that from the 24-hour urine collection. We were able to collect 109 24-hour urine samples and spot urine sample pairs, but of course, reflected the challenges with 24-hour urine collection. only 64 met or inclusion criteria for validation study analyses. And those criteria were that we needed collection time between 22 to 27 hours, a minimum of 400 mils of urine, and at least, not more than 4 days between the spot urine sample and the 24-hour urine collection. So again, we will be sharing some findings from the validation study in the session after lunch, and we will ask you to join Dr. Bennett for that presentation. So for the rest of this time, I will share a few of the findings on the knowledge regarding salt consumption from our survey. So this slide looks at Jamaicans' knowledge regarding common sources of salt in the diet. And we see that the participants were able to recognize some of the common sources of salt, such as salt added during cooking, the use of seasonings and sauces, also salted meats and fish as possible sources of salt. Persons, only a small proportion of persons, 37% recognize adding salt at the table as one way or one of the challenges regarding high salt consumption, and only 68% recognized bread and baked products as common sources of salt within the diet. Now, with regards to knowledge regarding the health effects of salt, again, we saw some differences. So persons were able to recognize that high salt diet would be a serious health issue. 97% of persons agreed with that. 94% recognized that reducing salt can result in significant improvements in health, and 97% also recognized the association between salt and high blood pressure. The proportions for other conditions associated with high sodium diet was much less well recognized, ranging from between 49% for association with stomach cancer to 75% recognizing an association with stroke. So while there is some knowledge, there is quite a bit that persons still need to learn. With regards to the salt content in commonly used foods, again, we see that there's quite a bit of variation in persons being able to recognize whether these foods were high or low salt. So they recognize with, in terms of some of the more common high salt foods, snacks and chips, etc., at 80-odd%. Only 16% recognized water crackers as a possible source of high salt. And I'm trying to find the section for breads. Buns, only 43% recognized breads and so forth as high salt food items. So again, there is quite a bit of variation, and there's quite a bit that we would need to educate the population so that they have a better index as to the salt content of commonly used foods. So we put all of this together in terms of knowledge scores, and this slide summarizes the knowledge scores. So we had 3 knowledge scores reported here. Knowledge score 1 looked at general knowledge about salt content, about salt and health, and this included 20 items. So overall mean score for knowledge score 1 was 13.9. Knowledge score 2 looked at salt content of the different food items, and these were 19 items, a mean score of 12, and the combined 39 items, a mean score of 26. When we translated that to a percent, we see that these were mostly in the 60s, so 69% mean for knowledge score 1, 65% for knowledge score 2, and 67% combined. So again, this suggests that there's some deficiency in our knowledge of the salt content of foods and general knowledge about salt. So while it's not a failing grade, there is a lot that we need to learn. So if we need to get our persons closer to the 90% bracket in knowledge concerning salt. Now, in terms of the the amount of salt that is recommended. Interestingly, most persons thought that it would have been half a teaspoon, so less than the actual recommended amount, which is about 1 teaspoon. So while many people didn't get it correct, they were erring on the side of caution. So that wasn't too bad. This part is a little bit interesting, though, because when we asked persons what they thought about how much salt Jamaicans consume, so most persons thought that we had too much salt. So this overall 49% too much salt and 37% far too much salt. Only 8% thought it was just right, and a few had too little, etc. When we asked persons, though, about their salt consumption, we found that it was a little bit different. So most persons believe that they consume just the right amount of salt. That's 43%. And 36% thought that they consumed very little. So only 18% thought they were consuming too much, and 2% thought that they were consuming far too much. So we see that as it stands now, most persons would seem to think that everybody else is having a high salt diet, but they are just about right. So we will need to do a bit more. Of course, this corresponds with what persons, in terms of the knowledge scores, because some of the things that they would assume are okay are actually high in salt content. So just to summarize some of the implications from this study, which we will continue to share the findings, and we hope to have the full dissemination showing all the details of our findings in early January. Well, not early January, probably late January. So gear up to come out and hear all the details of the findings. So this is the first national study with comprehensive data on salt consumption and also collecting data on knowledge, attitudes, and practices with regards to salt consumption. This enables the Ministry of Health to fulfill some of the requirements or the recommendations from the WHO Shake package. And as we have shared so far, we have documented high levels of sodium intake and low levels of potassium intake. And of course, these data will inform interventions to promote individual as well as population level reduction strategies. And the Ministry of Health is currently working on a national salt reduction program. So we will hope to hear about this in the more details of this in the near future. In terms of next steps, of course, we continue to work with the Ministry of Health in developing strategies for sodium reduction. We're currently working on a proposal to test the use of potassium-enriched low-sodium salt substitutes as a sodium reduction strategy. And what these salt substitutes involve is a mixture of 75% sodium chloride with 25% potassium chloride. And you use this instead of your regular salt in meal preparations, etc. And this will reduce salt content as well as increase potassium content. So we think that this is a useful strategy. We hope to get funding to have this study done. So we will keep you posted. We believe that there is need to further explore the nutrition composition of foods, particularly foods served in restaurants. As we pointed out, the restaurant owners weren't very keen to talk to us, so we really don't know what's going on in the restaurants. So we hope to be able to sample foods and to do the nutrition composition testing. And of course, we will need to continue to work with the Ministry of Health as well as non-governmental organizations to promote reformulation of foods to contain less salt and advocate for nutrition information to be made available for restaurant foods. So this is to acknowledge our team from the Caribbean Institute for Health Research, the Ministry of Health and Wellness. We also had some volunteer physicians working with the group, and of course our field team, without whom we would not be able to collect these data. So thank you very much, and we look forward to sharing more with you and to improve the health of our Jamaican people.
Thank you, Professor Ferguson. Now it's time for our Q&A session. Any questions online or on the floor? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation. A quick question. Did something the breast also food that not there a way that we test those food or maybe the of those and has high sodium content.
Okay, so we did have as one component of the study to look at the sodium content in packaged foods. There is another study that did collect data on that, and some of that has been reported. I don't recall the fine details. So the packaged foods would be would be the imported foods, and it's an important source of foods. And the packaged foods it would be relevant for both those that are imported as well as those that are produced locally. So that's an area that we need to also prepare the necessary reports on and ensure that the public is aware. The nutrition labeling promotions, which the Ministry of Health is currently doing, is one way to address that, because we want to ensure that persons are able to see what is the sodium and the other nutrient contents of the foods that are packaged and sold. And of course, there's a current challenge now as we try to get front of package labeling as one way to ensure that not only is the nutrition label that's on the back of the package, but also front of package labeling so that persons know exactly what they're eating. In terms of regulation, that is, I guess, a little bit more of a government responsibility. We work together in providing the evidence, and Dr. Davidson may comment. There are efforts to sort of regulate, or at least to have appropriate. The nutrition labeling is one way to look at that. But there are challenges as to how we can limit importation, but at least the appropriate labeling is important so that persons know what they're eating.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Very interesting presentation, Prof. I'm wondering about the substitute that you alluded to. In terms of having a higher proportion of potassium chloride. But from purely a palate perspective, a taste perspective, would there be a difference? Would somebody be able to discern that this has less sodium than the quote-unquote normal sodium chloride?
Yes.
I'm thinking about the acceptability eventually.
So that has been studied in other populations. We would, of course, need to do some local assessment to see. So they have different combinations of the low sodium salt. So you can have a 50-50%, you have the 75-25, there you could have other combinations. What they've found is that the 75-25 is about where people they get the good level of acceptability. So foods prepared with that 75-25, a lot of persons were not able to differentiate between the two. Another thing that is done in terms of using the potassium-enriched salts is that they sometimes add taste enhancers to ensure that the palatability and acceptability is there. But it has been studied, and the studies have shown that using these salt substitutes results in significant reductions in stroke as well as other cardiovascular disease. So it has been studied clinically. It is how do we get this implemented within the local context. And we believe that by conducting this study using implementation research strategies, that this will help us to show, first of all, that it is feasible, and then, of course, to help to promote this as a policy direction to address the challenges that we have.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question. Yes, go ahead.
To what extent have you considered the use of Celtic or pink Himalayan salt, which have more trace minerals in them, including potassium, which can be healthier alternative to table salt?
Yeah, so the issue of using sea salt, Himalayan salt, and so forth is something that is highly debated. So the first thing to recognize that it's still salt. There may be some advantages in terms of the coarser texture, etc., means that persons will actually use a smaller amount. So you may end up with less sodium. But if you're going gram for gram, the net effect is going to be similar. I'm not sure about the other mineral contents for the Himalayan salt, so that is something that we would need to study. But what I want to say is that I don't want persons to get comfortable to say that I'm using sea salt, I'm using Himalayan salt, so I'm fine. I think we still have to reduce net salt intake. But these are worthy considerations if we are going to reduce the total amount of salt.
Okay, we have, yes, go ahead.
Yes, there's too much salt in most chips, even when they mark lightly salted. Will there be fines imposed to encourage manufacturers to comply?
All right, so I am not the one who implements fines. So the WHO does recommend financial, or what is the word I'm looking for, tax measures as one way to look at promoting healthier eating. So that's a strategy that has to be discussed and implemented at the government level. One of the things, though, that we need, that I want to point out again, is the importance of reading nutrition labels, because sometimes the things that taste salty actually contain less salt than many others. So one of the things I remember, it was one of our professors that mentioned that the ketchup that we get has more salt than the fries. The fries taste salty because the salt's on the outside. The tomato ketchup has the salt in it, but it is hidden. So let us be a little bit more careful and actually read the labels, because one would be surprised to think that you are swapping, lightly salted banana chips for 2 slices of bread, and that bread may actually contain more salt than your banana chips.
Okay, thanks. And the last question is, have you and your team of researchers considered sample and analyzing meals from the menu of these restaurants for better data samples?
Yes, so the short answer is yes. For that, though, we need research funding. The funding that we got for this study did not allow us to do sampling. So we will hope, having established this, that we'll be able to write additional grants and we'll receive funding to be able to do samples so that we can have a better understanding as to the food landscape.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Professor Trevor Ferguson, for a superb presentation. Let's give him a what? Louise Bennett applause here and online. And at this time, we will now break for a commercial. Stay tuned and see you after lunch. Bye-bye.
I want to see a Jamaica that is cervical cancer free. Cervical cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer in women in our nation, and I want this to stop. The HPV vaccine has been proven to be the most effective method to prevent cervical cancer. It is a safe vaccine, and it is best to give the vaccine to young girls before they've even been exposed to the HPV virus. So parents, I want to encourage you to let your daughters get the HPV vaccine. Let us protect our next generation against cervical cancer.
Don't wait. Vaccinate against cervical cancer. A message from the
Check.